Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. Today is March the 21st, 2026, and this is the second part of my discussion on how or why the um, the Christian Sabbath came to be on a Sunday, which is separate from the uh, Jewish Sabbath, which is on a Saturday, right? To be clear, I had read from the Bible from Exodus 31 from verses 12, which indicated that, the children of Israel were required to observe the Sabbath, not celebrate, observe the Sabbath. And this is a distinction regarding um, Sunday and Saturday as well. I'll get to it. So the Jewish, the Israel, children of Israel in the book of Exodus 31 from verse 12, you see they were required to observe uh, the Sabbath as a day of rest. Um, However, uh, you know, after the death and resurrection of Christ, early church leaders would make a distinction between Saturday and Sunday. They worshipped on Sunday because that was the day Christ was resurrected. So you start to see this even in the New Testament, right? Prior to the Romans legalizing Sunday, and the early church leaders under the Roman emperors who had, converted to Christianity. Prior to that, you see within the Christian scripture, Christian literature, the New Testament, for instance, in from Acts chapter 20, verse 7, in case anybody wants to check that, Acts chapter 20, verse 7. There's also 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 2. And you can also see Revelations 1, verse 10. And it's called the Lord's Day. So Sunday came to be called the Lord's Day. So the resurrection of Christ was very significant for the early Christians because they saw it as a new covenant, right? A new covenant and a new creation, right? So the resurrection of Christ was celebrated by Christians on Sunday, that first day. They were commemorating it constantly on that first day of the week, which is Sunday. So they broke bread, they worshipped, they preached. Apostle Paul would preach. He also gave instruction that they should do collections, which you see happens on Sundays, right? They pass and they pass the offering bag, and Christians give their tithes, they give their offerings on Sundays, right? And that was what they were instructed to do by the Apostle Paul. And again, they have the authority from Matthew 18, verse 18 to 20, Matthew chapter 18, verse 18 to 20, where it says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, right? That's what Christ says there. And significantly, it was already practiced. It was already within church practice uh, prior to um, prior to the laws and edicts that came about with the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD. The Edict of Thessalonica was the law by Emperor Theodosius I, which made Christianity the official state religion, that it's the only state religion, and Roman citizens could no longer worship other gods. They could no longer have their polytheistic religion, their diverse gods anymore. They had to follow Nicene Christianity. Now, something important that also came from that the Council of Nicea in 325 AD, that also solidified Sunday, uh, Sunday as a day of observance for Christians, had to do with Easter. So, of course, Easter is the day of resurrection, and Christians always celebrate, Easter. If you notice, uh, the days change, right? So it happened, the Council of Nicaea, they made a rule concerning Easter, that Easter should always be celebrated on a Sunday as opposed to the 14th of Nisan, which is a Jewish Passover, because this can fall on any day of the week, right? So uh, the Council of Nicea in 325 AD, they made it a rule that Easter has to be celebrated on Sunday. Easter, of course, is the day of resurrection of Christ. So this also solidified, it institutionalized the practice. But again, the practice of worshiping on Sunday, of Christians observing and worshiping on Sunday, already existed in the New Testament. They were already doing it. But once the Roman emperors and the Romans made legalized Christianity and made Christianity the official state religion, um, they now created rules and made them law. The church uh, leaders created established rule that had the backing of Roman law, Roman authority, right? So and so that's basically it. That's how Sunday came about, and Christians started to observe Sunday as the day of rest, as opposed to um, the seventh day of the week, which is the Sabbath day for Jewish people. Again, on that day, Jewish rites, they have their strict customs on Sundays. They don't do anything. It's a day of rest, and they try to adhere to what the Old Testament says, right? But instead, the Jewish instead, when Christians celebrate their day of rest, it's a day of celebration of the resurrection of Christ. So you see how uh, the our church observance on Sunday, uh, takes place. It's different from Jewish rites and customs and practices on the Sabbath day, which is also very significant because remember, Jesus himself was Jewish. He observed the Sabbath. The apostles were Jewish. They observed the Sabbath. And so now they were trying to make Christianity distinct from Judaism, right? They wanted to make it distinct from Judaism. And you see, in fact, there was also a law, as I stated in the earlier video, there was a law which prohibited Judaizing, right? Judaizing, which is the practicing of Jewish customs, Jewish rites on Sabbath, on the Saturday Sabbath. This was in, what law was that? That was the Council of Laodicea between 363 AD and 364 AD, right? So that was very, very important because they created, the church leaders created a law, a rule prohibiting Judaizing on the Saturday Sabbath to make, they started to make the Christian religion and Christian practices distinct from uh, Judaism. So this was and Jewish custom and rites. This was very important for the early Christians, the church leadership at the beginning, and especially after Rome legalized Christianity. After Rome legalized Christianity, Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD. Remember, prior to that, Christians were persecuted in Rome. The Christians, they were thrown to lions, they were crucified. All the apostles of Jesus, just like Christ, they were executed, right? They were executed, except John. And John was one who received the revelations on the island of Patmos where he was exiled to, right? So all the early Christians, uh, apostles, the apostles of Jesus were all executed except John, right? Except John, and many of the early disciples were executed, and which made the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who lived, in the second century AD, he observed that Christians, they 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 sought martyrdom, right? They embraced martyrdom in a fanatical way. He said, they exhibited some kind of um, uh, rebellious obstinacy concerning martyrdom, concerning death. They would willingly, they didn't flinch, and he called it a theatrical, rebellious obstinacy, right? In the way they threw themselves, they think when the lions would come, they weren't afraid. They wouldn't convert. They would, they would adhere uh, to Christian dogma, embracing martyrdom. Uh, and the reason he observed this, I read his meditations as by Marcus Aurelius. He was the philosopher emperor of Rome. He was a philosopher. He was a Stoic, and in Stoic philosophy, the um, the direct adherence to embrace death, but in a calm, dignified, reasoned manner, right? They should accept death, but even though the early Christians didn't flinch from death, but Marcus Aurelius was criticizing them, saying that they were theatrical in the way they sort of embraced death. Right? It was just an act of rebellion on their part. They were just being stubborn, and they were being performative or theatrical about it without being calm or dignified. This was the opinion of Marcus Aurelius. But of course, things changed by the time of Emperor Constantine in 313 AD, so that Christians were no longer killed and persecuted and ridiculed. They now became Christianity was now the religion of the emperor himself. And by 380 AD, under Theodosius the First, 380 AD, it now became the mandated, required religion of all Roman citizens. They now had to practice Nicene Christianity. They now had to practice Christianity. And, you know, uh, paganism was no longer sanctioned by the state. So this is how Sunday came to become the day of rest for Christians, right? Um, I hope that explains it. My name is Olurotimi. Tomorrow is Sunday. If you you know if you're a Christian, go out and enjoy your worship and your day of celebration. To if you're if you observe the Sabbath, which is today, Sabbath is today for adherents of Judaism. That's good as well. By the way, I wanted to just quickly let me point out, just note, that it's not just the direct children of Jacob, right, that practice Judaism. So in the Old Testament, in the Torah, in the books of Moses, outsiders can also convert to Judaism, right? But they have to go through certain practices and rites and things like that. If we, in the modern times, if you observe the daughter of the president, Ivanka, she actually converted to Judaism when she married the Jewish man that's Jared Kushner, right? Jared Kushner, her husband's Jewish. And I remember when I was reading about them, she converted to Judaism. So they have practices, they have rites that they can go through. And this was an issue in the early, in the foundation of the church at the beginning, right? And you notice this, it's actually in the epistles of Apostle Paul, and he's referring to, he's reprimanding, the early Christians that, well, they shouldn't try and force new converts who are Gentiles, and they shouldn't try and make them circumcise and observe, Jewish rites. And of course, much later on, after Christianity was legalized by Emperor Constantine with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. Later on, with the Council of Laodicea in 363 to 364 AD, the church leaders then prohibited Juda- Judaizing, right? Judaizing, that's what it was called. That's um, the the practice of religious of Jewish custom and Jewish rites. So the church prohibited Judaizing uh, in 363 to 364 AD with the Council of Laodicea, and that's officially endorsed Sunday as the day of rest, the day of worship for Christians, right? As opposed to, as the Council of Laodicea put it, Judaizing on Saturday Sabbath, right? Because that was when Jewish people, and till today, that's when they observe the Sabbath day. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.